said, it's great to be back in this wonderful city where I spent 6 years, wonderful years actually, at the TTC, our iconic TTC. And so it's great to see so many familiar faces around the room, including lots of TTCers out there. So keep up the great work. And I'm also honored to be here at the Board of Trade that does so much to support this city and region. So lots to cover. As you said, Angela, in your kind introduction, I'm now in 35 years in public transport. So that journey is now continuing at Amtrak, where my mission is to hopefully finally get along with Martin, Canada, to finally get the US into the high-speed rail club. It really is an anomaly that the US, of all of the sort of major developed countries around the world, does not have true high-speed rail. We've got the Acela, which is great, but it's a high-speed train that is held back by the various disadvantages of running along non-specific infrastructure, or not a true high-speed route between Boston and DC. So I'm looking generally at corridors across the US, but specifically one very exciting project, watch this space, 240-mile route between Dallas and Houston, in which we're hoping to deploy, yet to be determined, we're hoping to deploy the legendary Shinkansen bullet train and bring that to the United States. So that will be quite the achievement if we can pull it off. But of course, it's not my first big infrastructure project. At the TTC, our mission between 2012 and 2017 was to simultaneously deliver not just one, but 5 major projects, all of which were infrastructure in their own ways: new streetcars and barn, rocket trains on Line 1, automatic train control, rollout of Presto, and the Toronto-York-Spadina subway extension, or the TYSSE. And all 5 were duly delivered at the same time, as we made an all-out push at the same time to improve all aspects of our customer service. Progress which, under the leadership of my friends Josh Cole, who's here today, and Karen Stintz, TTC chairs, led to the TTC being awarded the prestigious APTA Outstanding Transit System of the Year award, of which we were very proud. Of those projects, and they all had their own challenges, it was the TYSSE that presented by far the biggest challenge. And that experience colored how I subsequently approached delivery of London's Elizabeth line some 5 years later. And between those 2 projects, I've certainly learned what it takes to successfully deliver a major project by making mistakes and learning as you go along the way. Not as an engineer, I'm not an engineer, but as a transit leader who never had the luxury of just focusing on the project, you also had the small matter of delivering service. TYSSE and London's Crossrail, which, as you know, subsequently became called the Elizabeth line, both got into real trouble with the root causes of that trouble being clustered around a number of factors, which I now want to talk about. And it was so interesting hearing what Dan had to say, because I was finding myself mentally ticking off the boxes. It's so true what he covered, because that's definitely my experience as well. So it is a truism in life that if you fail to plan, then you're planning to fail. No one sets out to do that, of course, but too often projects get underway before key elements have been put into place. And the most common traps for any project revolve around deficiencies in the classics: scope, budget, structure, and schedule. So what are you looking to build? What's the available funding? How is the project set up? And how long have you got? Pretty basic questions. And these issues are all inextricably linked, and yet they frequently get cited as inadequate in post-project post-mortems, and they constantly resurface as the root cause of a project's malaise. We never seem to learn. And too often, and Dan covered this point, too often the desire for a positive political announcement drives key decisions that always come back to haunt you several years down the line, because political leaders and other leaders, civic leaders, eager to create a legacy and keen to put a spade into the ground, push for the shortest possible timeline with the flashiest assets at the lowest possible cost. Sound familiar? Now, value of money, of course, and the desire for excellence and ambitious schedules are not inherently bad, but each risks assumption that you will adopt and sign up to Herculean, often impossible schedules and for hopelessly inadequate budgets. In turn, stressed transit executives, mindful of who the boss is, often feel that they have no choice but to accept deep down that they know what they know to be unrealistic marching orders, hoping that all will be resolved once the problem gets underway. Now, never the case. Bosses compound their own misery if they don't pay attention to the contract structure, because so often that influences how things then unfold. So it's key to build in success from the start. You must lock the scope down. Budgets must be realistic, and no, that does not always mean going for the lowest price. Contracts must be flexible and manageable, and sufficient contingency must be built into the schedule to accommodate unforeseen problems. Now, of course, this is easier said than done, but it's incumbent upon the chief executive, the CEO or whoever, but the leader of the organization who will inherit the project. It is incumbent upon them to insist upon such basics as the scope of a project, its budget, and timeline from the get-go. After all, it's their head on the block. When we launched the Fast Forward plan to modernize New York City's transit system in 2018, we'd figured out how to re-signal the subway, the city's vast subway, in an unprecedented time frame, just 10 years overall, and new signaling for 90% of passenger journeys in half that time. So I was pretty pleased with that. I thought, this will go down well. This compared very well with the pedestrian pace of re-signaling up to that point, which had assumed a 40-year time frame. So we're talking about 10 years to do the lot, not 40, and 5 years to do 90% of passenger journeys. So I was somewhat taken aback, and this was in May of 2018. January, February, March, April, May. 4 months after I'd got there, we didn't mess about in putting that plan together. 4 months into my tenure, I was taken aback to be told in no uncertain terms by the then governor, if MTA management are saying it will take 10 years to re-signal the subway, then I will need to change MTA management. So I thought, well, that's a good start. I've only been here 4 months, and I've already had a shot across my bows. So you've got a choice then, right? Do you just go, yeah, fair enough, Governor, fair enough, we'll do it in 4 years? No, it was already an ambitious plan, so I stood my ground, managed expectations, more on that shortly, and resisted calls to slash the schedule. Fast Forward moved ahead apace, and it is being delivered to this day, albeit under the less catchy moniker of the MTA Capital Plan. Back to our case studies. In both London and Toronto, the way the contracts had been structured caused conflict almost from the get-go, leading to time-wasting disputes that impacted critical path and requiring interventions that I will cover in my third lesson later on. In London, when the tunnelling contract ran late, Bond Street station suffered immediate delay. Indeed, that station ended up opening 5 months after the rest of the line, and that was a real shame for the project, because the rest of it had opened in May of 2022. In Toronto, the project found itself caught in multiple disputes with and between contractors, the result being a cottage industry of claims and counterclaims that a different contract structure might have avoided. Meanwhile, back in London, the line got into difficulty because the time allowed to address the challenge of systems integration, anyone can build the civils, but the systems integration was woefully underestimated. And when the tunnelling and major civils wrapped, which is no mean feat, the then project leadership proudly proclaimed, this was in 2018, proudly proclaimed that an on-time, on-budget finish would be achieved, thereby bucking the norm for mega projects. I was at New York City Transit by that point, and I remember sending my chief capital officer to find out how this miracle had happened in the UK. Whoops. This was the middle of 2018. By the end of 2018, it was declared the project wasn't going to open. In fact, it had 1 more year to go. Well, actually, it had nearly 4 more years to go. Dawning realization around the complexity of completing the cavernous stations, of integrating new trains with a novel signaling system, and the sheer challenge of piecing together the world's first digital railway led to one missed deadline after another. The scope had clearly not been understood, leading to inevitable knock-on damage to both time and costs. So lesson number 1, get your basics right or you live to regret it. Okay, number 2, very closely linked to getting those basics right. In fact, I'd call it another basic. At all stages of a project, you've got to keep your stakeholders on side. And this extends just beyond keeping your political masters sweet. So, upon reflection, I didn't do that adequately in New York. That, I could have managed that relationship better, but we are where we are. Local community groups, customers, business representatives, and your colleagues are critical to the smooth progress of a project, especially when construction is taking place in a sensitive neighborhood. Here's a good example from Toronto. Construction of a new streetcar barn at Lakeshore and Leslie was never going to be easy, and things didn't always go as smoothly as we wanted. One bright light, though, was the community outreach program, which not only delivered countless community meetings and town halls, it also featured a drop-in center on Queen to answer questions and deal with problems as they arose. Very, very good practice. And such community engagement is something we pay great attention to when launching that Fast Forward project in New York City Transit. Resignaling the subway, putting in elevators, reimagining the bus network, it all needed to be explained to skeptical New Yorkers, my mantra being that the gain would be worth a little pain while the works were undertaken. So we undertook a grueling round of town halls, community meetings, political one-to-ones across all 5 boroughs, nearly 100 events in all. And it was hard work, but by the end we had huge political and public support and a mandate to deliver the plan, which is super important. I would say of equal importance, however, is also to manage your contractors, which is predetermined by how the contracts are set up in the first place. In my opinion, a partnership approach is the only way to achieve success. And in both London and Toronto, mounting pressure, political criticism, rising costs, and slipping deadlines quickly impacted relationships with and between contractors. And this led to more time being spent on finger-pointing and deflection than getting on with the job, and this cannot be allowed to continue. Typical of this was the situation on TYSSE, and to a lesser extent the Elizabeth line, where some contractors took a highly combative approach to the point of prioritizing settlement of commercial disputes over delivery, whilst others agreed to a more enlightened parallel approach in which work continued while the money was sorted out. Now, to be fair, many of the disputes centered around changes to scope, and just telling a contractor to live with it and swallow the cost isn't really the answer. All the more reason to get that contractual regime right from the start, as I mentioned earlier. And it's the responsibility of the project to set the tone, not the contractors, the project's responsibility. And that means declaring early on that all involved in a project are partners, treat them with respect, fix problems together, and don't resort straight to a directive or a dispute. And finally, management of stakeholders also means sometimes having to rein in the natural desire for shiny new things. I'm a fan of proven products. Dan made this point. I'm a big fan of proven products, of designs that work and where someone else has ironed out the initial problems. It makes sense, right, Martin? It's why we proposed a proven, modern CBTC signaling system for New York when others, won't say who, wanted to invent something from scratch. And it's why I'm also excited to be working on a project now for Amtrak, where we do intend to use Shinkansen technology. Why? Because it has a spectacular reliability and safety record. I'm all for progress, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So, lesson 3, let's talk about leadership and the importance of tight governance and effective project controls. It's all too tempting for some leaders to delegate all aspects of a project, to deflect questions around progress to a third party, or to put all the blame on the contractors. No. Even if the project in question is being delivered by a separate or a subordinate entity, as was the case with the Elizabeth line, the transit executive cannot and must not recuse themselves from the project. They cannot reframe their responsibility as only starting with trial ops or just turning up on opening day, tempting though that might be. In London, Crossrail, the project name for what became the Elizabeth line, was actually overseen by a separate board, with only loose links to the Transport for London hierarchy. And various project delays led to a TfL presence being put onto that board, but when that said body, as I said earlier, announced in mid-2018 that opening that year was no longer possible, the Mayor of London was completely blindsided. His go-to counsel, the then Commissioner of Transport for London, was equally caught out by this unexpected turn of events, and outrage ensued. I remember watching this from New York. But here's the rub. Either the project, and in turn transit leadership, did know that the project was in trouble and chose not to say, or they were blissfully unaware, which I would argue is even worse. On taking up the commissioner role in June of 2020, I was not about to fall into that trap. I insisted on bringing Crossrail in-house as a condition of my engagement, but not before we'd done some due diligence on the true status of what remained to be done. Importing the Elizabeth Line project, Crossrail, did mean importing full accountability and risk to TfL's reputation, but to me, it was the right course of action. We had to know the detail, and I personally had to be fully accountable. So what did this mean in practice? Every day, and they loved it, every day for 2 years, I made the project CEO and other key execs have an 0800 call for me to go through the previous 24 hours progress and to address issues before they ballooned. Where problems did arise, and there were many, I personally called the CEOs of the contractor concerned to ensure that we were given global priority. It was exhausting, but TfL's reputation was at risk, and the prize was certainly worth it. In Toronto, that corrosive, confrontational back and forth between the project and its contractors had to be stopped, not least when it became apparent that an already delayed project faced the very real prospect of several more years' worth of delay. And painful though it was, we brought in a new management team to change the dynamic, to implement tight project controls, to track cost and schedule, to get a grip on critical path, and to get the job across the line. Simply put, if you do not have adequate controls and governance, you risk a project getting out of control, you fool yourself into thinking you're further along than you really are, and you will reap the consequences in terms of negative impact upon budget and schedule. And if things are headed south, you must take action. So, commercial sensitivities notwithstanding, honest, timely, and transparent communication is key, whether a project is moving along nicely or if it's getting into trouble, and particularly with the latter. Sticking one's head in the sand is never an option, and those stakeholders whom I mentioned earlier have an absolute right to be kept informed. And this was certainly the case in London and Toronto. When I realized that change was necessary if we were to arrest slippage on TYSSE, I sat through hours of questioning in public by my commissioners and City Council, who rightly wanted assurances around such a controversial and dramatic move. Remember that, Josh? And thank you for backing me. Ultimately, we got the go-ahead against a commitment to no further slippage nor budget increase. And my commitment that day that we would have neither, no more time, no more money, was to a 2017 opening, a challenge that we duly met. In similar vein, having done the homework on what was possible, I publicly committed to no further slippage to schedule or recourse to public funds for the Elizabeth Line beyond those declared by the outgoing Crossrail board when we brought the project in-house. And this meant we had to achieve an opening window of the first half of 2022, a date that was deliberately broad, but that could be refined as things went on and became more certain. Such use of declared opening windows is good practice in any major project, as it balances the need to let stakeholders know what's going on without announcing a specific date before that is definite. And my final lesson relates to teamwork, because while much falls to the chief executive, it's the efforts of the entire team that deserve and deliver success. It is crucial to put your best people into key roles if you are to succeed. And if that means bringing in new faces or seconding people to the project, then so be it. In London, it was apparent from the start, or at the start of my tenure, that the stations were nowhere near as complete as was previously thought. You know, we declared this opening window, but goodness knows there was a lot still to do. So we brought in the same outside expert, Mike Dunham, the same outside expert that had pulled the TYSSE stations across the line back in Toronto. And we also brought in my old TYSSE project director into London to coordinate the program and to focus the glide path to completion. It worked a treat. On TYSSE, we brought in a proven railway operator in the form of Chief Operating Officer Mike Palmer to manage the incredibly complex task of starting up a new railway using new trains and a new signaling system, which is no mean feat, right? Doing all three at the same time. All of my executives did an outstanding job, including many who are here in this room today. In both cities, we were determined to achieve a flawless startup because that's what the public have paid for, and that's what the stakeholders both expect and deserve. And in both cases, an erroneous, annoying fire alarm activation at Paddington notwithstanding, this was achieved, and tremendous headlines ensued. When the Prime Minister, Premier, and mayors cut the ribbon in Toronto at the end of 2017, and when Her Majesty the Queen opened the Elizabeth Line in May of 2022, that, of course, made all of the headlines. But a lot goes into delivery of major projects, and it is to the TTC and TfL teams that the real credit lies. So these then are my lessons from a lifetime in public transit projects. Get these basics right, and you will set yourself up for success. They're certainly guiding us now as we contemplate this high-speed train for Texas. Every aspect of budget, scope, schedule, and structure must be got right if we are to move forward. So exciting times. Watch this space. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
There's a lot to unpack there, Andy, and we got about 9 minutes between us and cocktails, so we're gonna keep it focused. I wanna dive right in because you said two things that really resonated with me, and I saw a few heads move in the room, and one was that there's this cottage industry of claims and counterclaims that has spawned around these projects, and also that the contract structure is really what promotes the partnership. And so I know you talked about your 5 lessons learned, but maybe the way to frame this question is if you could go back in time and do one thing differently on the Spadina subway project, what would that have been based on what you've learned?
I think, you know, given the experience, I think without question, it would be to have paid more attention to have got the contract structure right. I mean, you know, it's something that we walked into, but if you get the contract structure right, so much falls out of that in terms of the way the contracts gel together, because invariably there's linkages, there's knock-ons. You know, if you've got a tunneling contractor, well then quite often the station's contractor is waiting for the tunneling to go through that particular site. If you've got the contracts right in terms of scope, you have fewer variations. And that you want to avoid the variations and the change orders because that drives cost, and because that also leads to, again, unnecessary arguments about who pays that dime. And if you don't get the sort of behaviors right between the contractors and with yourself as the project team, then again you just waste so much time, and more focus is put onto the commercial side of getting the job done than actually doing physical work. So I think if you get your contracting structure right based on a realistic budget, a realistic schedule, and a clearly understood scope of work, then you are setting yourself up for success.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm going to follow up a question about collaborative models. But just to get back to the claims aspect of it, you've obviously been involved in a number of large projects, a number of large claims. Any lessons learned or tips that you would offer to the audience, specifically once you find yourself in that situation when you're in a project that's mired in claims?
I would say get yourself a very good claims expert. And we did, actually. There were 3 people we brought in when the TYSSE got into trouble. There was actually an addition to the project team, but they were all put into the same Toronto team. One was a project director, one was the stations expert that we brought in to drive the stations to the finish line. And it's remarkable, he just had an eye for what was critical path, and critical path wasn't up to that point clearly understood. But the third person was very much a commercial expert because, you know, at the end of the day, we were dealing with contractors who were there to make money. And so in quite a few cases, I think they probably had a legitimate case, but in others, they didn't. So to have your own person within your own team who themselves, and this was, I think, the really clever part of the people that we brought in, who that person quite often was himself the commercial representative on the other side of the table, in other words, representing the contractor, arguing with the client. This time he was sitting in my camp. So the contractors knew that I had someone who, yeah, they can pull the wool over my eyes. I'm a linguist, I'm not an engineer. But they knew you can't bullshit this bloke because he knows you're bullshitting. So it was really, really important to have someone who could anticipate what the claim was likely to be, what the key points of that claim were, which bits were valid and which were just people trying it on.
Yeah.
And we developed in each case a strategy to minimize the cost on the dollar, and we actually, we'd achieved all but one by the time I left. So there was one outstanding. We got a pretty good return on the dollar, actually, in terms of the claims.
Yeah. I know one of the things that we've learned at Infrastructure Ontario is the earlier you can get those experts in and have conversations at the project level to try to resolve the claims before they start to escalate, because once you get into formal dispute proceedings, they tend to snowball and get away from you a little bit, and things get escalated. Yeah. But let's talk a little bit about claims avoidance, because that's where we all want to go, and collaborative models. You've had the benefit of working in multiple different jurisdictions. Who does it best? Where have you seen it work really well?
I think all the jurisdictions I've worked have had challenges. I think Australia was pretty good, actually, which was an interesting place to work because the Aussies do like a row. They do like to have quite a combative relationship in many ways, but I was peripherally involved with a project there that, by and large, from what I could see, was pretty robust in terms of the way the contracts have been set up and the way the commercials have been set out. But certainly my experience in London with Elizabeth Line, Toronto with the TYSSE, and from what I've seen in the US, I think we all fall into the same traps. And I remember my point in the words that, or in the speech that I gave, where so often the same mistakes get made time and time again, which is bizarre because there's so many case studies of how not to do it and therefore how to get it right going forward, and yet we never seem to learn. So that's certainly something that's very much front and center for me as I now embark upon this new national role in the US.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we're looking at Australia, the UK, other jurisdictions to learn lessons in the application of collaborative models. And I think Fred touched on it in that doing the assessments up front, determining whether or not you have a good partner that you're entering in is pretty key. It comes down to the people many times at the end of the day. Do you have the right people around the table to take that, bring that claims avoidance mindset to the table?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, it is commercial. You're in it, the contractors are in it to make money. I get that. But equally, you are typically the recipient and the guardian of public funds. So there's always going to be a bit of a tension there. But I've always thought that if both sides understand those two dynamics and understand and respect that you've each got stakeholders that you have to look after, then both parties in a positive relationship can still prevail. What's interesting in my current role, particularly Texas Central, is a whole new dynamic as I'm working extensively with Japanese partners, and that's a whole new cultural experience, a very, very different tone to negotiations that you have to master. So you need to know who you're dealing with on the other side of the table, but I still think even with different cultures, basic etiquettes and basic civility really do help move things along.
Yeah, and I really like your lesson learned about leadership matters, because it's also about when you have the wrong people in the role, you need to be prepared to make those changes too.
You do,
right?
and it's never personal and it's never pleasant, and you try to avoid that. But you're a poor leader if you can see that a project is just sleepwalking or barreling into trouble and you don't do anything about it. You are not doing your job properly if you duck a difficult decision. You've got to step up to the plate.
Yeah, absolutely. One last question, just in the time that we have left. We haven't talked a lot about the asset management and operating impacts of these major projects on our transit system. So tell us, and you talked a lot about project controls and the importance of project controls, but tell us a little bit about your risk management approach when it comes to taking into consideration the asset management and the long-term life cycle and operating for these assets?
So that's an excellent question, and again, that could have been a 6th or even 7th lesson learned. A lot of projects forget or just don't put enough emphasis on understanding the whole life cost of an asset. So, you know, a project might get delivered for there or thereabouts, and everyone celebrates, but then you suddenly realize you have just inherited or set in place a massive operating liability. And you suddenly realize that you've got huge OPEX costs, huge maintenance costs, and if you haven't factored those in and considered such things as renewals, then you'll soon have the gloss taken off your project when people realize that they've just taken on something that, yeah, might look nice, it's great, it serves a purpose, but there's actually going to be a drain on your resources if you've not thought of that. So, you know, that's why project managers are paid the big bucks. There's a lot of very, very key points that have to be made up front. And that's why I made the point, though, that you must take time to think all of that through. You know, picking up on Dan's points, you must think all of that through and not allow yourself to get steamrolled into signing up to something which is hopelessly ambitious and is only going to come back to haunt you.
Yeah. And maybe I'll just wrap by saying at Infrastructure Ontario, we do still believe in the tenets of integrating, operating, and life cycle into projects, and appreciating a lot of the transit projects in the market right now are not fixed price, so it makes it a little bit more challenging for a traditional P3 or DBFM, but we are looking at solutions that will allow us to continue to integrate the operating and the life cycle, because you're right, especially with the new technologies and different things being introduced, you don't want that surprise.
No, you do not.
Absolutely. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Andy. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.